There's a certain appeal to stories set in the Roaring Twenties, a glamorized time where, although the laws are strict, many choose to simply ignore them and pursue the life they want. A time of speakeasies, bootleggers, and flappers. And for those who made the choice to ditch the morals of the law and no longer adhere to their rules, unimaginable wealth made the gamble all the more rewarding. This was what inspired the great American classic, The Great Gatsby. Readers are immediately invested in the man and his lavish lifestyle, but what my English teacher neglected to mention was that the character may have been inspired by a real man. A man who really did make the conscious choice to cast aside the law, obtain that amazing wealth, and held those outrageous parties. This is the story that public education didn't want us to know. Behind every bottle is hundreds of stories, every step starting from growing grain until it reaches your glass. This spirit is collecting experiences and stories that it would love to tell you. It's my goal to sift through these stories, find the most meaningful, and bring them forward to your attention. This isn't another whiskey review channel or show. This is pure storytelling. I won't analyze every detailed tasting note of the spirit in the bottle. Instead, I'll dive into the details of the spirit behind the bottle. And this is the spirit of George Remus. Before we get to the lavish parties, we need to start our story with a kid. George Remus immigrated to the United States with his family at the age of 3.5 years old, and by 14, he was already working at his uncle's pharmacy to provide for his family after an illness had left his father disabled. The young teenager was ambitious, and by 19 had graduated from college and became a licensed pharmacist. At 21, he had purchased the pharmacy from his uncle, and within 5 years purchased a second. The ambition didn't end with his work and his studies. He became an endurance swimmer, and even set a record at one event for staying in the waters of Lake Michigan during the bitter, freezing cold winter weather for 5 hours and 40 minutes. Running a pharmacy would not be enough for the young man, and soon he started to take night classes to become a lawyer. A daunting task that normally took 3 years to achieve, but Remus completed in only 18 months. He specialized as a defense attorney, and was the first person to argue transitory insanity, now known as temporary insanity, as a defense in the court of law. He married, had a daughter, had an affair with his legal secretary, Augusta Imogen Holmes, then got divorced, and then married Imogen. Then, in 1920, Prohibition hit. Suddenly, Remus was mainly defending clients from liquor law violations. Even when his clients lost the case and were sentenced to pay fees up to $10,000, which is about $150,000 today, and a fifth of what the lawyer's yearly revenue was, his clients didn't seem to care and paid the fine effortlessly. He was amazed at how men who weren't as smart as him could obtain so much money. He quickly realized that prohibition was an opportunity, one that he fully intended to capitalize on. So he got to work. Utilizing his legal knowledge, he read over every detail of the Volstead Act, which was responsible for prohibition, memorizing every word and searching for loopholes, until finally he found what he was looking for. Under the new law, beer, wine, and liquor that had been produced pre-prohibition was considered private property and was not illegal to own. It could not be brought to market legally, so the inventory was just collecting dust, and the companies were looking to liquidate anything they could to try and recoup. So Remus could buy a near limitless supply of liquor for pennies on the dollar. Now he just needed a way to sell it to the thirsty American public. For this, Remus intended to utilize the fact that alcohol could still be obtained for medicinal uses with a prescription. If doctors were to write prescriptions for alcohol, then there would have to be a pharmacy that would be able to fulfill those prescriptions. So Remus used his past experience and decided to buy up and start new pharmacies to distribute his alcohol to. He now had a legal way of owning and distributing liquor during Prohibition. It would be easy to simply divert some of his shipments and cross into the illegal sales, making much larger profit margins and still maintaining his cover of legitimacy. It was at this point that Remus decided to move from Chicago, a city where gangs have already seized control over illegal liquor sales, to Cincinnati. He chose Cincinnati because at the time he found that 80% of bonded whiskey in the country was within a 300-mile radius of the city. He quickly started his operation, buying a closed distillery for cheap and using the legal permits to move the barrels of whiskey out of the locked warehouses, and then funneled them into the illegal market. The money he made off these sales he put back into his business, buying up more distilleries, pharmaceutical companies, and paying government officials. Around this time, a U.S. Treasury agent who suspected Remus's illegal activities planted a bug in his room, and was startled to learn that at one point a meeting of 41 people was held in the room, where they openly discussed the logistics of his illegal activities. This should have been easily condemnable evidence. However, the men in the room with him were mostly politicians, federal marshals, and other officials, and all of them were on Remus's payroll, which quickly caused the case to go cold. The Treasury agent even brought up the fact that Remus was planning to move 18 freight cars full of illegal liquor across the river, only to be met with nonchalant indifference from his superiors. Soon, Remus's business grew to astronomical proportions. In 3 years of operation, he now owned 10 distilleries and their stockpile of whiskey barrels, employed over 3,000 people, and directly distributed his illegal whiskey into at least 9 states. Not only was he collecting money from his illegal sales, but he would tell his men when and where he would be legally shipping whiskey so that they could steal it, and he could collect insurance on the product while still selling it to the much more profitable speakeasies. Remus had built the largest liquor empire in the country and became known as the king of the bootleggers. He purchased an already lavish mansion in Cincinnati and added an expansive pool, furnished the house with fine art, rare books, sculptures, and expensive furniture. At this point, George Remus is estimated to have a personal fortune between $3 and $6 million. That's without adjusting for inflation. $3 to $6 million in the 1920s. At this point, money held no real meaning to him. He held outrageous parties where he'd host more than 100 people in a night, had an orchestra to play at these parties, and was said to pour rare wine in quantities that matched the volume of their home's gigantic pool. He was also known for giving away equally lavish party gifts to his guests, from diamonds to new cars. His generosity didn't end at his driveway either. He was well loved in the community, allowing local children to play in his yard, and often supported numerous local charities. Remus was open about his blatant disregard for prohibition. He thought of himself as untouchable, above the law. He had paid off too many high-ranking officials in the government to be targeted. However, he could still be taken down by plain bad luck. One of his men was pulled over while making an illegal delivery of a case of whiskey and told the officers about where he had picked up the shipment from. Soon, George Remus's main distribution center, nicknamed Death Valley, was raided by the law, and he and some of his men were in handcuffs. He was brought to court on a couple thousand charges of violating the Volstead Act and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. George Remus, now in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, was placed in a cell with a man named Franklin Dodge, who he would become friends with. He eventually confided with Dodge that he had given his wife the power of attorney, meaning that she now controlled his empire and his fortune. Unfortunately, Dodge was actually a federal agent sent to try and extract information out of Remus about his criminal operation. However, rather than reporting this, Dodge went to Remus's wife, Imogen, and the two started to have an affair while Remus was waiting in prison. His only clue as to what was happening was the slow decline in the number of visits from Imogen. Meanwhile, the two were busy liquidating the assets of his empire that he had entrusted to his wife. Of his multi-millions, he would be left with only $100. Fearing Remus's wrath, the pair attempted to have him deported, and when that didn't work, assassinated. The would-be assassin feared being double-crossed by the unfaithful Imogen and the federal agent gone rogue, and instead decided to tell Remus about the plot. Still, Remus was unable to act from his prison, as his wife dismantled everything he had created and split it with Dodge. The day he was finally let out of prison, an old associate drove him to the mansion, only for Remus to find the doors locked and the windows boarded up. Sneaking in through the kitchen window, he was brought to his knees at seeing his home as an empty shell of what it once was. The chandeliers had been removed, where there once was majestic bookcases, now piles of discarded books lay on the floor. The fine pottery and paintings that littered the house in its prime were gone. In his bedroom was now a small cot and a pair of shoes that fit another man. His world was gone. Of course, after this, there was no trying to save the marriage. Imogen filed for divorce, and through much of the process, both her and Remus were accompanied by bodyguards, as they both believed the other would or had already previously attempted to kill them. On the way to court, the day that the divorce was scheduled for hearing, Remus saw his wife and his stepdaughter enter a cab. He instructed his driver to pursue them, chasing down the car and forcing them onto the curb. Imogen fled from the vehicle, and Remus chased after her. According to her daughter, he was cursing and acting like a madman. When he caught Imogen, the pair were now in Eden Park. Remus produced a revolver out of his pocket, pressing it against Imogen's abdomen, saying, "I'll fix you. I'll fix you." Remus then calmly walked out of the park and would turn himself in to the Cincinnati police. Imogen was rushed to the hospital, but 2 hours later the gunshot wound proved fatal. Remus was once again brought to trial, this time for first-degree murder. Remus decided to defend himself in court, and even used the same defense he had coined many years ago as a defense attorney. He claimed transitory insanity. For 6 weeks the battle was fought in court, and after only 19 brief minutes of deliberation, the jury ruled in sympathy of Remus and the emotional distress his wife's betrayal had caused him. As the jury had found Remus insane, he would now be placed into an insane asylum, but after only 7 months he was released. The quotes and insights of the team that had attempted to claim his sanity in order to prosecute him had been used by Remus to now prove that he had regained his sanity. Today, one of the distilleries that was owned by George Remus during Prohibition, Ross and Squibb in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, which is only 30 minutes away from Remus's old mansion, makes a bottle named after the king of the bootleggers in the style of the medicinal whiskey that Remus provided to the American pharmacies. Now, I think I'm going to have a glass of George Remus, for medicinal purposes. I've had a bit of a cough lately. If you enjoy these stories and want to make sure you don't miss on the next episode, join my mailing list. I'll have it linked in the show description. I hope you'll join me for more stories in the future, but for now, I'm Ryan Heinzen, and this has been the Spirit of George Remus. Next time on the Spirit of, we're off to Ireland. Hiding in the hills and mountains are stills, used to produce a historic beverage that is the precursor for whiskey. It's the story of the original moonshiners hiding from the law. There's folk songs, excise men, and maybe even whiskey. I'll see you there.